The summer of 1977 arrived in the Willamette Valley the way it always did, slowly, then all at once. One morning the hills were still green from the last of the spring rains, and by the following week they had turned the color of dry wheat gold, fading toward brown beneath a sky so blue it looked painted. The valley had its own rhythm, its own calendar, that had nothing to do with the one hanging in the post office. The ranchers knew it, the old farmers knew it. The families who had worked this land for 3 and 4 generations moved according to its pulse without thinking, the way a man breathes without counting his breaths. Maren Voss did not know that rhythm yet. She was learning it the hard way, which is the only way the land ever truly teaches anyone. She stood on the porch of the farmhouse on a Tuesday morning in late July, her second cup of coffee growing cold in her hand, watching a line of dust rise from the valley road below. The road wound up from the main highway through a corridor of Douglas fir before it opened into the long gravel drive that led to the house. And whatever was making that dust was big. She could tell by the way the cloud hung low and wide, spreading across the still morning air like smoke from a slow fire. She had not slept well. She had not slept well in 6 weeks, not since the phone call that had pulled her out of the small apartment she shared with 2 other women in Portland and sent her driving through the night to a farmhouse that suddenly belonged to her. August Voss had died on a Tuesday in June. He had been out in the barn working at his bench the way he always worked, quietly, deliberately, with no announcement and no fuss, and his heart had simply stopped. The neighbor who found him, Harlan Pruitt, said he looked peaceful, said he looked like a man who had sat down to rest. Maren thought about that a great deal in the weeks that followed, the idea that a man could work all his life and then simply stop, as if the body had finally decided it had done enough and chosen the most dignified moment available to make its exit. She was 25 years old. She had 2 years of art school behind her, a portfolio of watercolors that she was privately embarrassed by, and precisely no experience running 60 acres of Oregon farmland. August had never said anything to her about what would happen to the place when he was gone. He was not a man who talked about his own death or much about the future at all. He lived in the present, in the grain of the wood under his hands and the smell of the morning and the weight of a well-made tool. He had assumed, she supposed, that there would be more time. There always seemed to be more time, right up until there wasn't. The farmhouse itself was a 2-story structure built in 1931, white clapboard with green shutters set back from the drive behind a row of old laurel hedges that August had never quite gotten around to trimming properly. The porch wrapped around 2 sides of it, and from the western corner you could see clear across the lower pasture to the tree line that marked the boundary between the Voss property and the land belonging to Blackwood Ridge Vineyards. The winery had appeared in the valley 6 years ago, buying up 3 adjacent parcels and planting their first vines on the south-facing slopes. By the summer of 1977, they were producing wines that people in Portland were paying serious money for, and the operation had grown from a romantic enterprise into something that resembled a small industrial concern. Trucks came and went from their access road at all hours. New buildings had gone up on the ridge. The old families in the valley watched this with the particular wariness that rural communities reserve for rapid change. Maren watched the dust cloud resolve itself into a flatbed truck, heavy-duty, the kind built for hauling freight rather than farm equipment. It ground its way up the drive and pulled to a stop in the wide gravel circle near the barn. 2 men in work gloves climbed down from the cab without looking at the house, moving with the practiced efficiency of men who have a job to finish before noon. She set her coffee cup on the porch railing and walked down to meet them. She already knew what the truck was carrying. She had signed a contract 7 days earlier with a man named Everett Calloway, and this was the beginning of what that contract had promised. She had not fully understood when she signed it what the beginning would look like. Everett Calloway had found her 8 days ago in the back of August's kitchen garden, on her knees in the soil, trying to determine which of the sprawling plants were the heirloom perennials August had cultivated for decades, and which were weeds that had taken advantage of 6 weeks of inattention. She was losing that particular battle. The garden had its own opinions about what belonged there, and they did not entirely match August's plans. Calloway had come around the corner of the house without calling ahead, which told her something about him before he opened his mouth. He was dressed for an office rather than a farm, crisp blue Oxford shirt, khaki trousers with a crease in them, leather loafers that would be ruined by the mud near the squash beds if he stepped too close. He was somewhere in his mid-40s with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had settled into something more functional, the handsomeness now working in service of persuasion rather than attraction. His smile arrived before his words, practiced and warm in the way that smiles are warm when they have been deployed many times in similar situations. He introduced himself as the operations manager for Blackwood Ridge Vineyards. He said he had come to discuss a matter of mutual benefit, and he used those two words, mutual benefit, with the ease of a man who has used them so often they have become a single unit, like a coin worn smooth by handling. He explained the situation with careful patience, as if he had rehearsed this particular explanation and had refined it to its most efficient form. The winery used French and American oak barrels for aging their wines. After 3 or 4 vintages, those barrels were spent. The oak had released all the flavor compounds it ever would, and the wine had in turn saturated the stave so deeply with tannins and pigment that the wood was useless for any further aging purpose. They had accumulated a significant backlog of these barrels. Hauling them to the county landfill was expensive, and the landfill itself had begun raising questions about the volume. The winery's back parcel, the section up near the tree line, was presently unused. Just scrub growth and blackberry brambles, really. The idea was simple. They would pay Marin a monthly fee to store the barrels on that unused acreage out of sight behind the tree line, and in exchange she would have a reliable income stream for land that was currently producing nothing. Everybody wins, he said, and the phrase landed with the smoothness of something that had been said many times before. Marin had been kneeling in the garden, and she stood up slowly, brushing the dirt from her knees. She was aware of what she must have looked like to him. Young, uncertain, her hands dirty, her grandfather barely 6 weeks in the ground. She was aware of the farmhouse behind her with its dented gutters and the barn with its roof that needed attention in at least 3 places of the property tax bill, sitting on the kitchen table that she had looked at 3 times without being able to figure out how she was going to pay it. She felt the weight of her own unpreparedness, like a hand pressing on the top of her head. The contract he produced from a leather folder was 4 pages long. He pointed to the relevant sections, the monthly payment, the designated storage area, the general terms. She read the first page carefully, the second page less so, and by the third page, with Calloway standing there, radiating patient confidence, and the afternoon light shifting toward the gold, that meant she had more chores to finish before dark, her attention had begun to slide. She noticed the monthly figure, which was modest but real, the kind of money that would make the difference between a property tax bill that was a crisis and one that was merely an inconvenience. She noticed the phrase designated storage area and thought she understood what that meant. She did not linger on Clause 4, which was printed in the same font as everything else, unremarkable in its placement on page 3, containing language about volume and quantity that she would not read carefully until it was far too late to matter. She signed. Calloway capped his pen with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had expected this outcome. He shook her hand, his grip firm, brief, professional, and said the first delivery would arrive within the week. She thanked him for coming by. He said it was his pleasure, and she had the distinct impression that it genuinely was. Now the flatbed truck sat in her drive, and the 2 men in work gloves were pulling a ramp from beneath the bed and setting it against the tailgate with practiced ease. The first barrel came off the truck with a sound that startled her, a hollow thunder like a massive drum struck by something careless rolling down the ramp and tumbling into the grass at the edge of the drive before the men guided it upright. Then another. The barrels were larger than she had imagined, each one nearly waist-high on her, made from thick staves of pale oak held together by galvanized steel hoops that had already begun to show rust in long weeping streaks down the sides of the wood. The smell reached her before she got close. Not the romantic scent of a wine cellar. Nothing like the warm, complex aroma she associated with the barrel room she had once toured at a winery on a school trip. This was something rawer, closer to vinegar than wine, the smell of dregs and damp wood and years of fermentation settling into the grain itself. She watched them roll the barrels one at a time down toward the back of the property, following the path she had indicated when Calloway had walked the land with her. The designated area was behind the tree line, a flat section of about 8 acres that had indeed been scrubland when she showed it to him. A tangle of blackberry brambles, some volunteer alder saplings, a patch of tall grass that deer use for bedding. By the end of that first day, there were 47 barrels stacked in a loose pile at the edge of that clearing, and the pile already looked wrong to her eye, too large, too industrial, too out of place against the backdrop of old-growth fir and Oregon sky. The trucks kept coming. 3 more arrived the following day, 2 more the day after. By the end of the first week, there were more than 300 barrels on her land, and by the end of the second week, that number had grown past 600. They were not stacking them neatly. There had been no discussion of stacking. She realized the contract had specified storage, not organization, and the men who rolled them off the trucks were simply adding to the pile in whatever configuration was easiest so that the mass of barrels grew outward and upward in a chaotic heap that began to resemble from the ridge above the property something between a salvage yard and a failed construction project. The galvanized hoops caught the light in ways that were visible from the road. The smell drifted down on still evenings toward the lower pasture. By the end of the third week, when the final count reached 847 barrels, and the trucks finally stopped coming, Marin stood at the top of the hill above the tree line and looked at what had happened to that section of her grandfather's land. The pile was enormous, a mountain of pale and weathered wood, 15 feet high at its peak, spreading across nearly a full acre of ground. The blackberry brambles and alder saplings were invisible beneath it. The deer would not be using that clearing for anything anymore. She had not understood the scale. That was the simple truth she returned to over and over in the days that followed. She had imagined dozens, perhaps 100. She had not read Clause 4 carefully enough to understand that there was no upper limit specified, that the volume would be determined entirely by the winery's disposal needs, and not by any consideration of what that volume might mean in practice. Calloway had known. He had known what 847 barrels looked like on a piece of land, and he had smiled his practiced smile and said mutual benefit, and she had signed without reading carefully because she was 25 and alone, and the property tax bill was sitting on the kitchen table. She did not say any of this out loud. She had no one to say it to, not really. Her mother had died when Marin was 11, and her father had remarried and moved to the eastern part of the state, and they spoke at Christmas and sometimes in between. She had friends in Portland Art School, acquaintances, women from her neighborhood, but they were not people she called when things went wrong on a farm in the Willamette Valley. She was alone here in a way that she had not entirely anticipated, a kind of aloneness that was different from living by yourself in an apartment, because the apartment did not need anything from you. The land needed things constantly. Harlan Pruitt came by on a Thursday. He drove a battered pickup the color of old mud, and he pulled it over onto the gravel verge of the road where it ran along the fence line between his property and hers. He did not get out of the cab. He was somewhere past 60 with a face that had been worked on by decades of Oregon weather until it had the texture of the land itself, creased, sun-darkened, reading like a topographic map of a hard life lived in difficult terrain. He had ranched this valley his entire life, and his father had ranched it before him. And Marin had met him only twice since she had come to take over the farm, both times briefly, both times with the slightly formal quality of two strangers who share a fence line and are working out what kind of neighbors they intend to be. He leaned his arm out the window and pointed his thumb back toward the pile of barrels visible above the tree line. His expression was not unkind, but it had the weight of a judgment that had already been made. You let Calloway talk you into that. Not a question. That's a hell of a thing to put on your land, Marin. That's a fire hazard come next dry summer. That's rats by October if the weather cools right. He paused, and when he continued, his voice had something underneath it that was almost regret, as if he were delivering news about a medical condition. Your grandfather kept this place clean for 50 years. She wanted to say something that would sound reasonable. Nothing came. Harlan gave a single slow nod, the kind that means a verdict has been rendered, and pulled back onto the road. His truck disappeared around the curve of the hill, and Marin stood there in the afternoon quiet, with his words settling into her like water into dry ground. The whispers started within a week. Small communities in rural Oregon are not cruel by design. They are simply efficient with information and information about the Voss girl, and the barrel pile was too interesting to stay private. She heard it at the feed store when she went in for a bag of chicken scratch, the way the conversation between two older men near the back shifted slightly when she came through the door, not stopping, but changing register, the way a radio station blurs at the edge of its range. She felt it at the post office where the woman behind the counter was friendly in the specific way that people are friendly when they have recently been talking about you. She did not hear the exact words, but she understood their shape. The Voss girl was struggling. The Voss girl had been taken advantage of. The Voss girl had let a winery man turn her grandfather's land into a dump because she needed the money and didn't have the sense to read a contract. Every version of the story reduced her to the same essential figure, young female, naive, insufficient to the demands of what she had inherited. Each retelling was a small stone placed on the same scale, and the scale was tipping toward a verdict she did not want to accept. She avoided going into town when she could. She focused on the list of immediate repairs: the barn roof, the fencing along the north pasture, the pump on the well that had been running rough. She stayed close to the house and the garden, moving through her days with the focused tunnel vision of someone who has decided that if she cannot fix the large problem, she will at least fix every small one within reach. At night, she made lists in the margins of August's old notebooks, which were the only paper she had in abundance, and the lists were practical fencing supplies, roofing nails, lumber. But they were also a way of making herself feel purposeful when the alternative was lying awake, listening to the silence of a house that had once contained another person's life. She found the contract again on a Wednesday evening in late August, 6 weeks after the last barrel had been delivered. She had been going through August's filing cabinet in the room he used as an office, a small space off the kitchen that smelled of pipe tobacco, in old paper, looking for the deed documents she needed for the county assessor's office. The contract was in the same folder where she had put it under V for Voss, which was not a sophisticated filing system, but was at least consistent with August's approach to documentation. She pulled it out and sat down in August's chair, a heavy wooden thing on casters that he had made himself from salvage oak sometime in the 1950s, and this time she read every word. Clause 4 was not malicious in its language. It was worse than malicious. It was neutral administrative, the kind of prose that exists to describe arrangements without making moral judgments about them. It specified that the volume of materials to be stored under the terms of this agreement shall be determined by the operational needs of Blackwood Ridge Vineyards and shall not be subject to a fixed upper limit without written amendment agreed by both parties at least 60 days in advance. There was no cap. There had never been a cap. The 847 barrels currently occupying her back acreage were legally permitted, and if the winery generated more barrels next season, they could deliver more, and she would have no recourse under the contract she had signed. The monthly payment was real, at least. That part was accurate. But it was smaller than it had seemed when she was standing in the garden in dirty knees with the tax bill on her kitchen table, smaller when measured against the reality of what the land now looked like and what Harlan Pruitt's face had looked like when he pointed his thumb toward the tree line. She put the contract back in the folder. She did not sleep well that night either. The decision to go up the hill and look at the barrels directly, not in passing, not from the kitchen window, but to actually walk up there and face them, came to her on a Thursday evening in early September. The light that evening was doing something extraordinary, the way Oregon light sometimes does in the last hour before sunset, when the summer has nearly exhausted itself. It came in at an angle that turned everything gold at the edges, the fir trees along the ridge catching it and holding it in their needles. The dry grass in the lower pasture lit from the side so that each blade cast a thin shadow. It was the kind of light that made things look more real than they usually were, sharper at the edges, richer in color, as if the world had briefly decided to show you what it actually looked like beneath its everyday surface. She walked up through the pasture and through the gap in the tree line to the flat section where the barrels lay. The smell was still there. She had grown somewhat accustomed to it, the way you grow accustomed to any persistent smell, not liking it, but no longer being startled by it. The pile was settled now, the barrels having shifted slightly over the weeks into a more natural arrangement, the upper ones slumping against the lower ones in a way that made the whole structure look organic, like something that had grown there rather than been deposited. The galvanized hoops had progressed further into rust, and several of the staves had check split slightly along their length as the wood dried and contracted in the summer heat. A few of the barrels near the base of the pile had begun to collapse inward, the staves splaying apart as the structure that held them together failed. She picked up one of the fallen staves from the ground at her feet. It was heavier than she expected, dense in a way that surprised her. She had been imagining the wood as something already degraded, something halfway to rot, but the weight of it told a different story. She turned it in her hands. The outer surface was weathered to a gray-brown rough and slightly fuzzy, with raised grain, the kind of surface that comes from years of exposure to moisture and temperature change. But at one end, where the stave had broken cleanly from the barrel's structure, the interior face was exposed. The light caught it. The color that ran through the interior of that wood was unlike anything she had seen in a piece of lumber. It was not a surface stain. She understood stains from her art school years, knew the way they sat on top of a material rather than inhabiting it. This was not sitting on top of anything. It was in the wood, part of the cellular structure of the oak itself, worked into the grain by years of direct contact with wine, the tannins and pigments of thousands of gallons of fermented fruit absorbed by the porous cells of the heartwood and held there locked in. The color ran from a deep, saturated burgundy at the interior face, through gradations of amber and rust, toward the gray-brown of the outer surface. The whole cross-section of the stave reading like a geological core sample, a record of time and pressure and chemistry compressed into 3 inches of dense oak. She stood there holding the broken stave in the September light for a long time. Long enough for the light to shift for the gold at the edges of things to begin softening toward the blue of early evening. Long enough for her to stop looking at what was in front of her and start seeing it. Her grandfather's workshop came back to her in pieces. Not as a memory she was reaching for deliberately, but as something that arrived on its own, summoned by the weight of the wood in her hands and the particular quiet of that hillside. August's workshop had occupied the north end of the barn, a space he had built out over many years to suit his specific requirements, the workbench he had made from a single slab of old-growth maple, 8 feet long with a vise at either end, and a row of hand-cut tool holders along the back. The windows on the north and west walls placed where they were to capture the most consistent light. The smell cedar shavings shellacked the hot metal scent of the sharpening stone after he had been working the blades. He had been a cabinet maker by trade, though trade was not quite the right word for what August Voss did, because trade implied a transaction that was primarily financial. What he did was more like a vocation. He made things from wood, because he could not imagine not making things from wood, because the act of taking a piece of material and discovering what it wanted to become was the central fact of his life. His particular gift, the thing that set him apart from other craftsmen in the valley, was reclamation. He sought out wood that other people had discarded, pulled from collapsed barns, salvaged from houses being torn down, cut from trees that had fallen in storms and been left to season in farmers' woodlots. He had an eye for it, for the wood that had been through something that carried the marks of its history in ways that made it more interesting rather than less. Waste, he had told her once, she could not have been more than 8 or 9, sitting on a stool beside his bench, watching him run a hand plane along a board that had come from a demolished mill building in the Coast Range waste, is just a failure of imagination. The wood has lived a life. It has a story. You don't cut it without understanding what story it's trying to tell you. He had guided her hands on that hand plane, his large, calloused hands over her small ones, showing her how to let the weight of the tool do the work instead of forcing it. Feel that he had said as a thin curl of wood lifted from the surface. That's the wood saying yes. Standing on the hillside with the broken stave in her hands, Marin heard something that had nothing to do with sound. It was more like a recognition, the kind that arrives not as a thought, but as a physical sensation, a shifting of something in the chest or the gut that precedes understanding by a few seconds. 847 barrels of white oak. Not garbage, not industrial waste, not an eyesore on a piece of land her grandfather had kept pristine for 50 years. 847 barrels of time. Everett Calloway had looked at these barrels and seen a disposal problem. Harlan Pruitt had looked at them and seen a fire hazard and a monument to her own naivety. The men who had rolled them off the trucks had looked at them and seen a job to be finished before noon. Every single person who had looked at this pile had seen the end of something, the end of the barrel's usefulness, the end of the winery's obligation to deal with them, the end of what the Voss land had been under August's care. But August himself had taught her to look at discarded things differently. He had taught her that the wood which had endured the most had the most left to give. He had spent his entire life finding proof of that principle in collapsed barns and dismantled ships and trees left to rot in forgotten woodlots. She looked at the color running through the broken stave in the failing September light. Deep burgundy amber rust, the geography of years written in oak grain. No factory could produce that color. No stain, no chemical process, no human intention could replicate what 5 years of direct wine contact had done to the cellular structure of this wood. It was a color that existed nowhere else in the world, not in this combination, not in this depth, because it had been made by time, which was the only material that could not be manufactured or purchased or hurried. She set the stave down carefully against the nearest barrel. Not thrown, not dropped. Set down the way you set down something you intend to come back to. The valley below the tree line had gone blue in the early dusk. She could see the light in the kitchen window of the farmhouse, yellow and warm, and beyond it, the dark bulk of the barn with its roof that still needed work in 3 places. And further down the slope, the fence line of Harlan Pruitt's ranch running along the bottom of the hill like a sentence at the end of a paragraph. She stood on that hillside for a long time after the stave was set down, long enough for the first stars to appear above the tree line, long enough for the temperature to drop to 10 degrees that September nights in the Willamette Valley drop as soon as the sun is fully gone. She was not making a plan yet. She was not ready for a plan. What she was doing for the first time since the phone call 6 weeks ago that had ended one version of her life and begun another was something simpler. She was listening. Not to the valley, not to the night sounds of the farm settling around her. She was listening to the weight of the stave she had just set down, to the color she had seen in its broken face, to a voice that was her grandfather's, and also something older than that, something that had been in the grain of the wood long before August Voss ever ran a hand plane across it. She had signed a contract without reading the fine print. She had let a man with a practiced smile and a leather folder walk onto her land and offer her something that looked like help. She had done these things because she was 25 and alone, and the alternative had felt like admitting she could not manage what she had inherited. The neighbors had noticed. The town had drawn its conclusions. The pile of barrels was real and large and smelled of vinegar in the evenings. All of that was true. Every single part of it was true. So was the color of that broken stave in the September light. She walked back down the hill to the farmhouse. In the kitchen, she poured the cold coffee from the morning down the sink and made fresh. She sat at the table with August's oldest notebook open in front of her, the one that went back to the 1940s. His handwriting in the early pages still European, in its precision, the letters formed with the care of a man who had been taught by someone who believed that the quality of a man's handwriting revealed the quality of his mind. She found the page she had been looking for, the one she had read quickly 3 weeks ago without understanding why she was reading it. The wood that has survived the most has the most left to give. She sat with that sentence for a long time in the yellow kitchen light. Outside, the Willamette Valley settled into its September night. Around her, the temperature dropping, the first coyotes calling from somewhere on the ridge above the winery's land. The property tax bill was still on the table. The barn roof still needed work. The contract with Everett Callaway was still in the filing cabinet under V for Voss, with its Clause 4 and its unlimited volume and its mutual benefit. None of that had changed. But Maren Voss, sitting in her dead grandfather's kitchen in the farmhouse she had inherited without wanting, drinking coffee she had made at 9 o'clock at night because she would not sleep anyway, had changed in the quiet, specific way that people change when they stop looking at a problem and start looking at it differently. Not better, not worse, differently. The shift was small. It would be months before it amounted to anything that the outside world could observe or measure. The town would keep talking. Harlan Pruitt would keep driving past with his judging silence. The barrels would keep sitting on the hill, smelling of old wine and weathering slowly into the Oregon seasons. But the color of broken oak in September light was in her now, the way the wine had gone into the wood, deep, cellular, permanent. She closed the notebook. She went to bed. For the first time in 6 weeks, she did not make a list before she slept. The barn in October smelled of cold coming in through the gaps in the siding of old hay, compressed into the floorboards over decades of the particular dryness that descends on wood structures in the Pacific Northwest when the rains have not yet returned. Maren had spent 3 days cleaning the workshop end of the barn before she touched a single tool, sweeping the floor, clearing the bench, shaking out the canvas apron she had found hanging on the same nail where August had always hung it. The apron was heavy cotton, stained in patterns that recorded decades of work, dark streaks of oil, pale ghost rings of shellac, one long smear of something reddish-brown along the left side that she could not identify. She put it on. It was too large for her, built for August's broader frame, and the ties wrapped around her twice. She cinched it tight. The tool chest sat against the north wall, heavy oak, the lid fitted so precisely that it opened without sound. She had looked inside it several times in the weeks since August died, but had not removed anything. Now she took out each tool in turn, laid them on the bench in the order August had kept them, the hand planes arranged by size from the long joiner down to the small block plane, the chisels in their leather roll, the draw knife, the spokes have the marking gauges. Some needed sharpening. Most needed only cleaning, a thin film of oil, wiped away the blades, checked for rust. She spent the entire first day on this sharpening cleaning setting, each tool back in its place, with the care of someone preparing an altar for a ceremony they do not yet fully understand. The first barrel she brought into the barn required 20 minutes of effort just to move it. The barrels were heavier than they looked, and they did not roll cooperatively on the uneven ground between the pile and the barn door. She wrestled it upright, tipped it onto its edge, walked it forward in small rocking steps, the way you move a large appliance across a floor and got it inside with her arms shaking from the exertion. She knocked off the rusted hoops with a hammer, 3 strikes on each one, the metal giving way with a sound like a flat bell, and pried the staves apart with a timber chisel she braced against the bottom head. The barrel disassembled into its components 2 circular heads, their wood pale and wine-soaked 32 staves curved along their length like sections of a wooden sphere. She selected the most promising stave, the one with the deepest color in its interior face, the color she had seen in the September light on the hillside. She clamped it to the bench. She took August's number 4 bench plane, tested the blade against her thumbnail, sharp enough just barely, and made the first cut. The plane skipped. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but the blade caught on something in the grain and jumped sideways, leaving a diagonal gouge across the face of the wood rather than the smooth shaving she had expected. She reset the plane, adjusted her grip, tried again. This time the blade chattered a rapid vibration that she could feel up through her wrists and into her forearms, the cutting edge bouncing along the surface rather than slicing cleanly through it, leaving a washboard texture that was worse than what she had started with. She stood back from the bench. The wood was not behaving like any wood she had worked with before, which was admittedly not much wood. Some pine in an introductory woodworking class at art school. A small shelf she had built for her apartment from dimensional lumber she bought at a hardware store. The density of this oak was different from anything in that experience. Heavier, closer grained, the tannins that had penetrated deep into the cellular structure, having done something to the fibers that she did not yet have language for. She tried reducing the depth of cut on the plane, backing the blade off until it was barely protruding past the sole. Better, but only slightly, the shavings that came off were paper thin and immediately crinkled the wood, releasing them reluctantly rather than letting them curl up in the clean ribbons she had watched August produce. She switched to a handsaw, thinking she would cut the stave into smaller sections and work with those. The saw moved through the first inch without trouble. Then the kerf began to close behind the blade as the wood's internal tension shifted, pinching the saw, requiring her to work the blade back and forth with increasing force until she had gained another half-inch. The dust that came off was dark, almost purple, settling on the bench and on her forearms in a fine powder that stained immediately wherever it touched skin. By the time she had cut through half the stave's width, her shoulder was burning and the saw blade was hot enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from the steel when she held her hand near it. She finished the cut. The 2 pieces fell apart. She looked at the cross-section. The color stopped her completely. She had seen it before on the hillside in the September light, that first broken stave. But here in the barn, in the flat gray morning light coming through August north windows, the color was even more complex than she had registered. The interior face was a deep, saturated burgundy that shifted as she tilted the wood, picking up amber in one direction, going almost black in another. The grain lines running through it in patterns that reminded her of topographic contour lines on a survey map, the record of a landscape rendered in biology rather than cartography. It was not uniform. It was not simple. It was the most interesting cross-section of material she had ever seen, and she had spent 2 years in art school being shown interesting materials. No painter could have produced that. No stain, no chemical process designed by human intention could have replicated the depth of it, the way the color existed inside the structure of the wood rather than on its surface. It was not a coating. It was a transformation, 5 years of direct contact between American white oak and fermented grape juice, the sugars and pigments and tannins, working their way into the cellular material of the wood through the simple physics of absorption, pressure, and time. She sat down on the stool beside the bench. Her hands were purple-black to the wrists, stained by the sawdust. She looked at them for a moment, then looked at the 2 pieces of wood on the bench in front of her. The cut surface was beautiful. Getting to it had been a disaster. She understood something, then sitting in October light in her grandfather's barn with her stained hands in her lap, she understood that she was fighting the wrong battle. She had been approaching the wood as if it were dimensional lumber, something to be flattened and straightened and forced into compliance with a predetermined shape. But this wood had spent years developing its own internal logic, its own set of tensions and densities and opinions about what it was and what it was not. The curve of each stave was not a defect to be corrected. The density was not an obstacle to be overcome. The color was not incidental. It was evidence of a process that had changed the material at a fundamental level, and any technique that ignored that process would keep failing, the way her plane had failed, the way her saw had bound up and burned. She needed to work with what the wood already was, rather than against what it refused to become. The problem was that she did not yet know how to do that. The following 3 months were an education conducted entirely in the language of failure. She filled the wood stove at the far end of the barn every evening with the wreckage of that day's attempts. Split staves, collapsed joints, a chair leg that had looked promising until she put weight on it and felt it flex in a way that no chair leg should flex. She tried steam, a rudimentary setup using a secondhand wallpaper steamer she found at an estate sale in McMinnville. Connected to a pine box she built herself, directing the steam into the interior of the box to relax the stave fibers before working them. The steam helped, but only if she got the timing right, working the wood in the brief window between when it became pliable and when it began to check from the moisture change. She learned to recognize that window by feel by the way the wood responded to the draw knife, rather than by any clock. She learned the draw knife in those months the way you learn something that your body eventually understands without your conscious mind having to supervise it. The draw knife was August's preferred tool for rough shaping, a two-handled blade pulled toward the body along the grain of the wood, removing material in longer, faster strokes than a plane. On this wood used correctly, it could follow the existing curvature of a stave. Rather than fighting, it could peel back the weathered outer layer to reveal the wine-cured heartwood beneath without fracturing the fibers. Used incorrectly, it caught on the grain and tore rather than sliced, leaving surfaces that would require hours of remediation. She ruined 11 staves before she understood the direction of pull well enough to ruin only 1 out of every 4. That ratio felt at the time like progress. Everett Calloway arrived on a Wednesday in November. She heard his car on the gravel drive, not the flatbed trucks which she had grown accustomed to over the summer, but the sound of a passenger vehicle moving with deliberate unhurry up toward the barn. She was at the bench with her back to the door when he appeared in the opening, and she did not turn around immediately. She was in the middle of a draw knife pass on a stave she had been working for an hour, and she had learned that the middle of a pass was not the moment to change anything. She finished the stroke, set the draw knife down, turned. He was dressed the same way he had been in August's garden, the pressed shirt, the crease in the trousers, the shoes that were wrong for a working farm. His expression was not unfriendly. It was something more carefully neutral than unfriendly, the expression of a man who has arrived to assess a situation and has not yet decided what the assessment requires of him. His eyes moved across the barn, the tool chest, the bench, the scattered stave sections, the pile of barrel components she had broken down and stacked against the south wall. They settled on the stave she had just been working, its interior face up on the bench, the color visible even across the distance of the workshop. "I heard you'd been spending time up here." His voice had the same practiced ease it always carried. "Thought I'd stop by to see how you were getting on." She wiped the draw knife blade with the cloth she kept on the bench for that purpose. "Getting on fine." He came a few steps further into the barn. His eyes were doing the kind of quick inventory that comes naturally to people who manage operations for a living, tallying inputs and outputs, estimating productivity. He looked at the staves. He looked at the tool chest. He looked at the 3 or 4 finished or near finished or failed pieces she had moved to the far end of the bench. "You're making furniture." Not a question, not an endorsement. More like a man reading a label on a container he did not expect to find in a particular location. Trying to. Something shifted in his expression, not contempt, because contempt required effort, and what crossed his face was more effortless than that. It was the expression of someone who has encountered a situation that is slightly sad without being particularly surprising. His next words arrived with a gentleness that was somehow worse than directness would have been. "Miss Voss, these barrels are barrels. I mean the materials you're working with here, they're industrial waste. They're spent. There's a reason we've been paying to dispose of them." She kept her eyes on the cloth in her hands, working it along the blade. His tone shifted into something more administrative, less gentle. He mentioned Clause 4. He mentioned with the careful precision of a man who has read a contract more thoroughly than the other party that the materials stored on her property remain the operational property of Blackwood Ridge Vineyards until formally disposed of, and that any commercial use of those materials that is using them to produce goods intended for sale would constitute a use of winery property for private profit, which would trigger a compensatory adjustment to her monthly payment under the terms they had both agreed to. She put the cloth down. She looked at him directly for the first time since he had entered the barn. "Show me where it says that." He did not have the contract with him. He described it. She told him she would read it again herself. He said that was perfectly reasonable, that he simply wanted to make sure they had clarity between them, that clarity was important for a productive, ongoing relationship. He said a few more things in the same register. Professional measured faintly concerned the tone of a man who is doing someone a favor by explaining a situation they have misunderstood. Then he left. She read the contract that evening at the kitchen table. She read Clause 4 3 times. She read Clause 7, which she had not previously noticed, which dealt with derivative uses of stored materials. The language was ambiguous, deliberately she suspected, but the ambiguity cut both ways. It did not clearly prohibit what she was doing. It did not clearly permit it either. What it did very efficiently was introduce uncertainty, the specific kind of uncertainty that makes people with limited resources think twice before spending those resources on a fight they might lose. She held the contract over the kitchen table for a long moment, long enough that her arms grew tired. Then she put it back in the folder, folded her hands on the table, and sat in the kitchen quiet. The wood stove ticked in the corner as it cooled from the evening fire. Outside, the November rain had started against the windows, the first real rain of the season, the kind that came in off the Pacific and settled in for weeks, turning the valley roads to mud, filling the creek at the bottom of the lower pasture. She could hear it on the barn roof, a sound like distant applause. She opened the old notebook to the page she knew by memory, now the page with her grandfather's sentence about wood that had survived. She read it once. She closed the notebook. She did not fold the contract differently or put it in a different drawer. She simply left it where it was and went to bed. And in the morning, she went back to the barn. She had not been defeated. She had been warned. Those were different things. But the warning had cost her something, a certain ease, a certain confidence in the rightness of what she was doing. She worked through November with that discomfort sitting in her chest, like a stone she could not dislodge, and the work itself became harder for it, not technically, but emotionally. Each failed stave feeling more like evidence of Calloway's unstated verdict: this is industrial waste and you cannot make anything from it. The stone was still there in January when she heard about Silas Drummond. She heard about him the way you hear about people in rural communities, obliquely in passing, from a source that did not know it was giving you information. She had driven into the valley's small hardware store for a replacement blade for her coping saw, and the man behind the counter, making conversation while he looked in the back for the right size, mentioned that he had just shipped an order of specialty sandpaper to a fellow up in the mountains outside Cottage Grove, an old furniture maker who went through more abrasive paper in a month than most shops went through in a year. Nobody much knew him down here, the counterman said, but folks who did said he made chairs that fit your body like they were made for you specifically. Said he'd been up in those mountains for 30 years and hadn't come down for anything that didn't require a hardware order. She drove back to the farm with the saw blade in her coat pocket, thinking about a chair that fit your body like it was made for you specifically. She thought about it for 2 weeks. She went back into the barn and worked for 2 more weeks, and at the end of those 2 weeks, she had produced one chair that was recognizably a chair 4 legs a seat, a curved back formed from 2 staves that followed their natural sweep. It was not beautiful. 2 of the legs were not quite the same length, which gave the chair a slight rocking quality on a flat surface. The back was stable but slightly asymmetrical in a way that was visible if you looked directly at it. The joints were held together with wooden pegs she had cut herself using the Appalachian method August had recorded in one of his notebooks: no glue, no screws, the peg expanding slightly in the mortise as the wood settled into its new relationship. It would hold weight. It would not collapse if you sat in it without thinking about it first. She loaded it into the truck along with 3 of the best staves she had worked, the ones with the deepest, most complex color, the ones she had prepared most carefully, the surfaces as smooth as she could get them with the tools and skills she currently possessed. She drove north on a Tuesday morning in February, up through the Coast Range foothills, into the mountains east of Cottage Grove, following directions she had gotten from the hardware store counterman who had them from the shipping address on Silas Drummond's sandpaper order. The road that led to Silas's place was unpaved for the last 4 miles, hemmed in by Douglas fir, so tall they blocked the sky to either side, leaving only a pale stripe of gray February overhead. The cabin sat in a clearing that the trees had conceded reluctantly, a low structure with a metal roof and a covered porch, where firewood was stacked in walls that reached the eaves. There was a workshop attached to the back of the cabin, larger than the cabin itself, its exhaust venting 2 metal chimneys. Smoke was coming from both of them. He came out onto the porch before she had finished turning the truck around. He was older than she had expected from the description. Somewhere past 70, she guessed, though age had compressed itself in him, rather than expanding, as if decades of physical work had consolidated him, rather than worn him down. He was not tall, but he was broad with hands that she noticed immediately. Large, scarred at the knuckles, permanently darkened in the creases, from years of oil and finish, that no amount of washing had fully removed. He wore canvas work pants and a flannel shirt. No coat despite the February cold, and he looked at her truck with the particular expression of someone who is accustomed to living without visitors and has no policy about them one way or another. She got out, she told him her name, told him she had come from the Willamette Valley, told him what she had been working with, and that she had been told he might know things about wood that she needed to know. He did not respond immediately. He walked to the bed of the truck and looked at the staves she had laid there, looked at the chair. He picked up the best of the three staves. She could see him choose it deliberately, his eyes moving across the three before his hands went to the right one, and held it in both hands, the way a physician holds a limb, feeling its weight distribution. He turned it. He brought it to his face and inhaled at the end grain. He ran one thumbnail along the interior face at an angle, a gesture she did not understand the purpose of, but watched carefully. Then he looked at the stave's interior, the color, the depth of it, the way the burgundy shifted toward amber in the flat February light. His expression did not change dramatically. He was not a man whose face moved easily from one register to another. But something happened behind his eyes, a stillness that was different from the stillness that had been there before. Less like indifference, more like attention that had been arrested by something unexpected. 50 years I've been working wood. His voice had a rasp to it, the rasp of a man who spent most of his time alone. Bought wood, salvaged wood, dried wood, planed wood in every species this country grows. Never saw color run this deep from the inside out. He set the stave down. He looked at the chair. You're treating it like it's green lumber. She did not argue because he was right. She had been treating it like something that needed to be forced into shape, rather than something that had already found its shape and was offering it to anyone willing to pay attention. He allowed her to stay 2 days. He did not offer this as a gift. He simply did not tell her to leave, which she understood to be equivalent. He worked in his shop during the days, and she watched. He was not a teacher in any formal sense. He did not explain what he was doing or pause to check that she was following. He worked and she observed, and the information passed between them, the way information passes in that kind of situation, not as instruction, but as demonstration, absorbed through the eyes and the hands rather than through the ears. She saw him sharpen a plane blade with a secondary bevel so small it was nearly invisible to the naked eye, a micro bevel added at the very tip of the blade's cutting edge that changed the geometry of the cut for extremely dense wood that had been compressed by pressure, saturated by liquid, worked by time into something closer to stone than to the green lumber her technique had been designed for. She watched him set up a mortise with a hand-chisel cutting with the grain in one direction across it, in another the sequence of cuts removing material in a specific order that prevented the wood from splitting along the stress lines that the wine saturation had created. She watched him steam a piece of curved material, not to reshape it, he was clear about this without words, only clear through the way he handled it, but to relax it, to allow the internal tensions to equalize, so the surface could be worked without the grain tearing out. The second afternoon, he set a stave she had brought on his own bench. He picked up a plane she had never seen before, smaller than August's block plane, the body machined from a single piece of bronze rather than cast iron, the weight of it clearly significant in his hand. He made one pass along the interior face of the stave. The shaving that came off was continuous, paper-thin, perfectly, even in width from one end to the other, and it curled up from the blade in a single, unbroken ribbon that caught the light as it fell. The surface left behind looked like water. She understood then what she had been doing wrong, not as a list of technical errors, but as a single fundamental misalignment. She had been in a conversation with the wood in which she was doing all the talking. You could not do that with a material that had its own history, its own opinions, its own internal record of everything it had been through. You had to ask. You had to be willing to receive an answer you had not planned for. He said it more plainly on the morning of her second day while she was attempting a draw knife pass under his observation. She was pressing too hard, trying to control the direction of the cut through force rather than by reading the grain. He put one finger on the back of her right hand, just one finger, a light pressure, and she stopped. Don't tell the wood what it is, his voice level and unhurried. Ask it. She eased the pressure. The knife moved differently suddenly, as if the wood had been waiting for exactly this reduction of effort to offer what it had been withholding. She drove back down the mountain on the second evening, with the truck empty of the staves she had brought. She had worked them all, practiced on them until they were beyond further use, and with her mind in a state she recognized from art school, the state that followed a genuine lesson when the new information had not yet settled into skill, but was actively rearranging the furniture of your existing knowledge to make room for itself. The barn in March felt different when she entered it. Not different in any physical way. Same tools, same bench, same stove in the corner, same smell of cold wood and old oil. Different in the way that spaces feel different when you return to them with a changed understanding of what you are supposed to be doing in them. She spent 2 weeks rebuilding her sharpening setup, adding the micro bevel to the bench plane and the block plane the way she had watched Silas do it. She rebuilt her steam box longer, better insulated with a proper valve on the steamer so she could regulate the pressure. She practiced the draw knife until she could hear the difference between a cut that was going with the grain and one that was beginning to fight it. The sound a reliable guide in a way that her eyes alone had not been. The wood began to respond, not immediately, not without continued error and continued loss of materials to the stove. But the ratio shifted. She was ruining 1 out of every 6 staves now, instead of 1 out of every 4, and then 1 out of every 8. And the pieces she was producing had begun to lose the self-conscious quality of first attempts. The slight overcorrection in every joint, the hesitation visible in the surface marks, and to take on something quieter. Instead, something that suggested a hand that was beginning to know what it was doing without having to think about each movement separately. By May, she had a bench, 2 chairs, a small side table, a coffee table whose top she had assembled from 11 stave sections of slightly different wine saturation levels, the colors ranging from pale amber at the edges through progressively deeper burgundy toward the center, the whole surface reading like a topographic map of flavor and time. She had finished everything with the pure tung oil that Silas had used. Nothing else, no varnish, no sealer, just the oil working into the grain and hardening there, leaving a surface that was matte in indirect light, but came alive with a deep, warm luminosity when the sun hit it directly. She put the bench on the porch of the farmhouse on the first warm evening in May, the same porch where she had stood with cold coffee in her hand the previous July, watching the dust cloud rise from the valley road. She sat on the bench. It held her weight without the smallest complaint. The curve of the seat, which followed the natural sweep of 2 matched staves, fit the back of her thighs in a way that no manufactured furniture had ever quite fit them. She sat there until the evening light left the valley. The town's whisper had not stopped. She still heard it occasionally, the edge of it caught in a passing exchange, the slight adjustment in a conversation's register when she entered a room. But the subject had changed without the town quite knowing how to categorize the change. The talk was no longer about the barrel pile or Callaway, or whether the Voss girl had the sense to manage what she had inherited. The new version vaguer lacked the satisfying narrative of the old version. She's up in that barn all the time, doesn't come to town much. Something's going on up there, but nobody quite knows what. Nobody had looked inside the barn yet. Nobody had seen what was accumulating against the rough sawboard walls, the chairs, the tables, the bench now on the porch, each piece made from material that Blackwood Ridge Vineyards had considered worthless enough to dispose of for a fee. Nobody outside that barn knew what the interior face of a wine-saturated oak stave looked like under tung oil in good morning light. The door was closed. The work was accumulating behind it. Maren Voss was 30 years old, 5 years into the life she had not chosen, and she was becoming without witnesses, without encouragement, without anyone telling her that what she was making had value, exactly what the wood had been waiting for her to become. Somebody with the patience to ask the right questions and the willingness to accept an answer she had not anticipated. The barrels on the hill were fewer by 60 or 70, now the deficit barely visible against the original mass of the pile. The pile still looked enormous from the road. Callaway still owned the narrative of how it had gotten there. Harlan Pruitt still drove past on his way to town without stopping. But the bench on the porch was there, and it was real, and the light did something extraordinary to it in the mornings when the sun came over the eastern ridge and hit the porch boards at the right angle. The color ran all the way through. The morning Constance Whitfield turned down the wrong road, Marin was on the porch with a cloth in her hand, working tung oil into the surface of a new bench she had finished the previous evening. It was June of 1982, a Tuesday, the kind of Pacific Northwest morning that justified every other kind of morning. The region produced the air cool enough to hold its shape, the light coming off the eastern ridge at a low angle that made the valley look newly made. The laurel hedges along the drive, catching the dew in ways that turned each leaf into its own small mirror. Marin had been up since 5. She worked best in the early hours before the day developed opinions about what it wanted from her. She heard the car before she saw it. A well-maintained engine, the sound of tires on gravel moving with the careful speed of someone who suspects they are in the wrong place, but has not yet confirmed it. The vehicle that came around the curve of the drive was a dark green sedan German-made, the kind of car that belonged in Portland's West Hills rather than on a farm road in the Willamette Valley. It slowed as it approached the house, then stopped altogether 20 feet short of the porch steps. The woman who got out was somewhere in her early 50s, dressed in a linen blazer over dark trousers, her silver-streaked hair pulled back with the precision of someone who understood that understatement was its own form of authority. She had the bearing of a person who moved through spaces professionally assessing them, cataloging their qualities and deficiencies in real time. She took 2 steps toward the porch, her mouth already open with what was clearly going to be a question about directions. Then she saw the bench. She stopped. Not the polite hesitation of someone who has noticed something attractive, a full stop, the kind the body makes when the eyes have sent urgent information that requires processing before locomotion can resume. She stood in the gravel drive for a long moment, her head tilted slightly, the question about directions apparently forgotten. She came to the bottom of the porch steps. Her eyes moved across the bench's surface, the joinery, the curve, the way the 2 matched staves formed the seat's contour, the color. She was close enough now that Marin could see the quality of her attention, the way it was not casual admiration, but the focused appraisal of someone who spent her professional life evaluating exactly this kind of object. "I apologize for coming onto your property unannounced." Her voice was measured, unhurried. "I'm looking for the Blackwood Ridge access road. I seem to have taken a wrong turn somewhere after the main highway." She paused, her gaze still on the bench. "But before you direct me that piece, I've never seen a stain create that kind of depth. What is it?" Marin set the cloth down on the porch railing. "It's not a stain. The wood is from an old wine barrel. The color is in the grain itself. The wine did it over 5 years of contact." The woman was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than social convention required. "Then may I look at what else you have?" Her name was Constance Whitfield. She had a design firm in Portland. She had been working for 18 months on the interiors of 3 luxury mountain lodges being developed by a real estate partnership in the Cascades. The kind of project where the aesthetic brief used phrases like authentic material narrative, where clients paid significant money for the feeling that what surrounded them had not been manufactured, but had somehow arrived through a process connected to the actual world. She had sourced furniture from craftsmen in Vermont, from reclaimed wood operations in Montana, from a salvage specialist in New Mexico. None of it had produced what her clients described when they described what they wanted, because what they described was not a style. It was a quality that was very difficult to source, because very few people knew how to produce it deliberately. It required material that had genuinely been through something, worked by someone who understood what that something had done to it. She stood in August's barn for nearly 4 minutes without speaking. Marin watched her move from piece to piece, the 2 chairs against the south wall, the side table, the coffee table with its mosaic of graduated color, the new bench whose oil was still tacky in the morning air. Constance touched each piece not possessively but analytically, her fingertips reading the surfaces the way a reader's eyes move across a page with specific questions in mind. She crouched to examine the mortise joints on the chair legs. She tilted the side table to look at the underside of its top, at the way the stave sections had been fitted together with wooden pegs along their edges. When she finally spoke, her voice had changed register slightly. The professional assessment still present, but underneath it, something less managed. "These aren't furniture pieces. They're documents. Each one is a record of a specific material's specific history." She straightened, turned to face Marin directly. "Who else has seen these?" "No one." Constance took a breath. "I need 10 chairs, 3 dining tables, 5 of the benches for the main lodge. There will be 2 additional lodges after that if the partnership approves the first installation, which they will." She named a price for the first order without any preliminary negotiation, without the careful circling that Marin had observed in the few commercial exchanges she had conducted since taking over the farm. The number she named was not hedged or softened. It was precise, delivered with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking at. Marin's hands, which had been still at her sides, tightened slightly. The number was more than the farm had generated in the 5 years of August's final working period combined. She told Constance she would need 3 months for the first installment of pieces. Constance said she could work with that timeline. She wrote a check for a third of the total as deposit. She had a checkbook in the leather bag over her shoulder, which Marin noted, and which told her that this woman had come prepared for the possibility of purchasing something, even if she had not expected to find it down a wrong road in the Willamette Valley. They shook hands on the porch. Constance accepted the directions to Blackwood Ridge that Marin gave her, drove out the way she had come, in the green sedan, disappearing around the curve of the drive behind the laurel hedges. Marin stood on the porch for a considerable time after the sound of the engine faded. Then she went into the barn, sat down on the stool beside August's bench, and looked at the check in her hand. The paper was cream-colored, the printing precise, the dollar amount written in Constance's careful hand. She looked at it until the number stopped seeming like an abstraction and started seeming like a fact. Then she made a list. She had always made lists. The habit had gotten her through the first year on the farm, when every day brought 3 new categories of things she did not know how to do. But this list was different from the lists about fence posts and roofing supplies. This list had a different quality to it, the quality of someone who is no longer managing a problem, but building something. The check's deposit portion went first to the bandsaw. She drove to a dealer in Eugene, a large professional-grade machine with a cast-iron table and enough throat width to handle the longest staves without repositioning. The second purchase was a drum sander, which would allow her to surface large panels to a consistent thickness without the hour of hand planing that each piece currently required. These 2 machines did not replace the hand tools. They could not, for the final stages of work for the joinery and the fitting and the finish work where the quality lived. They compressed the early stages, the rough dimensioning, the stock preparation, so that the hours she had been spending on setup could be redirected to the work that only hands could do. The third expenditure was Decker Briggs. She had heard his name in town the previous winter mentioned by the hardware store counterman in the context of a young man who was looking for work, who was reportedly good with his hands, who had recently left a construction job when the contractor he worked for ran out of contracts. Decker was 24, the son of a family who had been in the valley for 2 generations, raised with the practical mechanical competence of people who fix their own equipment rather than paying to have it fixed. She had also, in the way that small communities make all information available to those paying attention, heard him mentioned at the feed store in a conversation that had included a reference to the Voss place, something she had not been meant to hear. The tail end of a sentence about the strange business up on the hill with all those old barrels. She called the number she got from the hardware store and offered him a trial month. He arrived on a Monday morning in the first week of August, drove his truck around back, walked into the barn, and looked at the space with the evaluative silence of someone assessing a job site. She showed him the bandsaw, the drum sander, the stack of barrel components broken down and sorted by quality. She explained what the work was. He picked up a stave, turned it, looked at the color on the interior face. His expression did not perform surprise, which she appreciated. He looked at it the way a tradesman looks at an unfamiliar material, with the interest of someone who wants to understand how it behaves, rather than an opinion about whether it should exist. "What do you want me to do first?" His voice direct, uncomplicated. She showed him. The following 10 weeks were the most productive period of her working life to that point. Decker learned the rough preparation stages quickly. He had good instincts about machinery, about the relationship between feed rate and blade tension on the band, saw about the drum sander's appetite for stock that was not quite flat. He did not have the feel for the finish work yet, the draw knife passes and the hand planing and the final fitting of the joints, but he did not pretend to have it either, which was the quality she valued most in him. He took direction without resentment. He asked questions that were specific rather than general. He worked with a steadiness that did not require management. They filled the first order in 11 weeks, 1 week over the timeline she had given Constance. The pieces went out on a rented flatbed, 10 chairs, 3 dining tables, 5 benches, each one wrapped in moving blankets and secured with ratchet straps, the whole load representing more hours of skilled labor than Marin had applied to anything in her life. She followed the truck to the lodge site in the truck she had driven to find Silas Drummond 2 years earlier. She watched the pieces being carried in through the lodge's front entrance, set in place against the rough-hewn walls and the stone fireplace surround, and she understood something about what she had made that she had not been able to see in the barn, where the pieces had been produced in isolation from one another. Together they told a story. Not a single story, each piece had its own internal narrative, its own color distribution, its own record of which part of which barrel had contributed its particular history to this particular form. But together they created an atmosphere that was coherent in the way that only genuinely consistent things are coherent, not manufactured consistency, not the consistency of matching sets produced in a factory to a single specification, but the consistency of things that share a common origin, the way the stones in a riverbed share the character of the river that shaped them. Constance was there when the last piece was placed. She walked the room with her client, a man from Portland, whose money came from real estate, who had the expensive casualness of people who have owned beautiful things long enough that beauty no longer surprises them. He stopped in front of the large dining table. He put his hand on its surface. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said something to Constance in a low voice that Marin could not hear from across the room. Constance nodded, looked at Marin, gave a single small nod that contained its own complete sentence. The second lodge was confirmed the following week. The money from Constance's first order changed the practical structure of Marin's life, with the directness that only significant money can change things. Decker became permanent rather than trial. The barn gained better lighting, a row of fluorescent fixtures along the ceiling that allowed work in the early morning and the late evening hours, extending the productive day by 3 hours on either end. She bought a proper kiln moisture meter, which told her what her hands had been telling her, imprecisely, the exact moisture content of each stave, which determined how it would behave under the tools. Small knowledge, specific knowledge, the kind that compounds. The barrel pile on the hill diminished in a way that was now noticeable from the road. Not dramatically, not with any sudden visual shift, but progressively, the peak of the pile, dropping a foot by October, another foot by the following spring. The valley began to notice not the pile's size, but its slow reduction, the way communities notice change in landmark objects gradually, then, with a rush of recognition. The conversation at the feed store had a different texture now when Marin's name came up in it. Less pity, less the narrative of the naive young woman taken advantage of. Something harder to categorize, not quite admiration, but its precursor, a suspension of the prior verdict, a willingness to revise. Everett Calloway came back in the spring of 1984. She was in the drive supervising the loading of a dining table, a new commission not from Constance, but from an architect in Eugene who had seen the lodge installation when she heard a car she recognized, or rather a car of the type she recognized, the sound of something well-maintained arriving at a moderate speed that communicated intention without urgency. The vehicle that came around the curve of the drive was not the same car he had driven before, but the man who got out was the same man adjusted by years. His shirt was still pressed, his trousers still creased. But something had gone out of him that had been present before, not his composure, which was intact, but the quality underneath the composure, the particular confidence of a person who has never been in a room where they held a disadvantage. He looked different standing in her drive. Not older exactly, though he was. More specifically, he looked like a man who had driven somewhere he was not certain he should have driven for a reason that required more explanation than he usually needed to provide. His eyes went first to the table being loaded onto the truck, its surface, its color, the care with which Decker was wrapping it in moving blankets. Then they went to the barn, its doors open, the sound of the bandsaw running inside. Then finally they went to the hill above the tree line, where the barrel pile had been reduced to perhaps a third of its original volume. The remaining barrels organized under tarps, rather than left in the chaotic heap of 1977. Miss Voss. His voice carried its old professionalism, but without the warmth that had previously animated it. The warmth she now understood had been a tool rather than a quality. I owe you a visit that I should have made some time ago. She waited. He looked at the table on the truck again, looked at it for longer than a glance required. I heard things over the past year or so, stories about furniture, a lodge project outside Bend. The architect we use for our tasting room expansion mentioned your name in a conversation that surprised me considerably. He paused. I came to see it for myself. She told Decker to finish the loading, walk to where Calloway was standing, faced him with her hands at her sides. The afternoon light was on her back, which meant it was full on his face, and she could read the expression there without difficulty. It was the expression of a man who had done a calculation and arrived at an answer he had not anticipated. "We've been burning them," he said, his voice dropping in a way that was not theatrical, just quiet with the specific weight of a fact that has been true for too long. "The barrels we can't fit in the current storage arrangement, we burn them every winter. We have for years, hundreds of them." He looked at the tarp-covered pile on the hill as if seeing it recalculated. "Our marketing team has been doing research into premium reclaimed materials. There's a significant market developing for exactly this kind of thing. Authenticated provenance, regional origin documented process. Our barrels would be—" He stopped. He started again. "Is there any possibility of a different arrangement, of recovering some of the materials we've already disposed of, or of establishing a new channel for the ones we continue to produce?" She let the question sit in the air between them for a moment. Not to be cruel, cruelty required investment in someone's suffering, and she had none to spare for Everett Calloway. She let it sit because it deserved to be heard clearly by both of them, the full shape of what he was asking. "This is my inventory, Mr. Calloway." Her voice carried no heat, no satisfaction, nothing but the level clarity of a fact. "Every piece of material under those tarps is spoken for in commissions that extend 3 years out. There's nothing available." She paused. "The arrangement we have is the arrangement we signed. You receive the monthly payment. The materials are mine to work with, as I determine." He heard the reference to Clause 4 without flinching, which she gave him credit for. He had used that clause as a warning 2 years after she signed the contract, used it to introduce doubt about the legitimacy of what she was doing. Now the same clause protected her because the materials were on her land, under her management, with the winery's own signature on the document that had placed them there. Whatever Calloway's marketing team thought about premium, reclaimed materials, they had given those materials away for a monthly fee in 1977, and the contract that accomplished that transfer was the same contract he had brought to August Garden in a leather folder with a practiced smile. He held out his hand. She took it. The handshake was brief, firm on both sides, nothing performed about it. Two people acknowledging the shape of a situation that both now understood completely. He thanked her for her time. He walked back to his car, unhurried his posture, not defeated but settled like a man who has accepted a verdict he recognizes as fair, even if it was not the one he came seeking. She watched the car go down the drive and around the curve behind the laurel hedges. She stood there for a moment in the afternoon quiet, feeling the residue of the exchange settle in her chest. There was no triumph in it. Triumph required an opponent, and Calloway had never been exactly that he had been an obstacle. A pressure, the specific gravity of someone else's advantage applied at a moment of her maximum vulnerability. What she felt instead was simpler than triumph, more structural. The feeling of a weight that has been present so long you stop noticing it until the moment it was removed. Harlan Pruitt came on the Saturday in September. He came not in his truck, but on foot, which surprised her. His ranch was a quarter-mile down the road, and he was past 65 now, moving with the deliberate care of a man whose joints had accumulated a record of everything they had done over a long life. She saw him through the barn's open door, walking up the drive in the mid-morning light, hat in his hand, rather than on his head, which she had never seen before. She came out to meet him. He stopped at the barn door. He looked inside at the pieces in progress on the bench at Decker, working at the bandsaw with ear protection and safety glasses, at the organized stacks of barrel components against the south wall, at the tool chest in the corner, with August's tools laid out in their proper order on a cloth above it. He looked at all of it with the unhurried thoroughness of a man who wants to form an accurate impression rather than a quick one. His face, when he finally turned to her, had the particular expression that appears on a man's face when he has been wrong about something for a long time and has arrived at the moment of saying so. Not ashamed, Harlan Pruitt was not a man constructed for shame, but honest in the specific way that old-fashioned men are honest when the evidence in front of them cannot be argued with. "Your grandfather kept this place his whole life," his voice carrying the rough-edge quality of someone unused to this particular kind of speech. "Kept it clean, kept it right. I watched him do it for 40 years, and I thought I knew what right looked like on this farm." He looked back into the barn once more. "August Voss would be proud of what you've done here, Marin. I was wrong about what I said, wrong about the whole thing." He put his hat back on his head. He walked back down the drive without looking back. She stood at the barn door and watched him go. The morning light was on the valley in the particular way it had in September, the same angle it had been on the evening she had stood on the hill, with the broken stave in her hand, the angle that made the color of things more honest than it usually was. The fence line between her property and Harlan's ran along the bottom of the lower pasture, the same fence line he had driven past in his mud-colored truck in the summer of 1977 to deliver his verdict. From where she stood, she could see the entire sweep of the farm, the house, the barn, the pasture, the tree line above it, the tarp-covered pile on the hill, reduced now to something that looked more like a managed resource than a catastrophe. She did not call after him. She did not need to. What he had given her was worth more than any elaboration could have added to it, and she understood that he knew this, that the brevity was not curtness, but respect, the respect of one person for another's ability to receive a thing completely without needing it unwrapped. The years that followed built on each other with the quiet momentum of compound interest, each commission leading to another, each finished piece carrying the story of the material forward into a new space where someone else would live alongside it. Constance's 3 lodge installations became a reference that architects across the Pacific Northwest began to cite to clients who asked for the feeling of authenticity without being able to name exactly what they meant by it. The name Voss Barrels acquired the specific gravity of things known by those who know, which is a different kind of currency than mass recognition. And in the market Marin occupied was considerably more valuable. By 1988, she had a waiting list. By 1990, she had stopped adding to it, redirecting new inquiries to a 4-page document that explained the material, the process, the timeline, the pricing information that eliminated the casual inquiries while deepening the commitment of serious ones. Decker stayed. He became over those years something more than an employee and something different from a partner, a craftsman in his own right. His initial mechanical competence, having grown through daily contact with the work, into a genuine feel for the material and ability to read a stave's grain with a draw knife in a way that had required teaching rather than arriving on its own. She taught him the way Silas Drummond had taught her, not through instruction, but through demonstration, information, passing between hands rather than through language. The barrel pile was gone by 1993. Not hauled away, consumed one barrel at a time, each one disassembled and evaluated, and either worked into finished pieces or set aside as unsuitable. The unsuitable ones, the only ones that ever went to the wood stove. 847 barrels reduced over 16 years to zero through the patient application of attention and skill. The clearing behind the tree line was visible again. The blackberry brambles had returned, the alder saplings had grown into actual alders, the deer had come back to the clearing in the early mornings. In 2000, Harlan Pruitt decided to retire. He was past 75. His sons had moved away from the valley decades earlier. His daughter was in Bend with her own family and her own life. The ranch, 420 acres of valley floor and hillside that his family had worked for 100 years, needed to go to someone. He called Marin on a Tuesday evening in March. She bought it. The price was fair, agreed between them in a single phone conversation without lawyers or intermediaries. The way things were done between people who have been neighbors long enough to understand what each other values. She did not buy it to expand her operation. She bought it because she could not watch it be subdivided, could not watch the hillside that defined the southern edge of her view from the barn be dotted with houses that would arrive within a generation, regardless of what she did, unless she did something to prevent it. She put the land into a conservation trust 2 months after the title transferred a permanent legal protection that would outlast any subsequent owner run with the land itself. In the same way that mineral rights or easements run with land invisibly perpetually as a fact of the property, rather than an intention of any particular person. Harlan came to sign the Conservation Trust documents on a Thursday morning. He sat at August's kitchen table with the papers in front of him and a cup of coffee he had not touched, and he read every page with the slowness of a man who intends to understand what he's doing. When he finished reading, he picked up the pen without ceremony. "This land'll still be land in 100 years, he said, signing. "That's worth more than what I could have gotten breaking it up." By 2005, Voss Barrels was a name that appeared in the pages of architectural design publications, in the commissioning documents of hotels and restaurants, and private residences across the Pacific Northwest. The pieces that bore the name were signed by Marin on the underside, the signature in the simple block letters August had used for his own work. The Voss tradition was not to announce, but to mark quietly a fact of origin that would be there for whoever looked. Marin was 53. Her hair had gone the color of the interior face of a well-seasoned stave, A warm silver shot through with the occasional strand of the darker brown it had been. Her hands, which had been soft when she arrived at the farm in 1977, with dirty knees from the kitchen garden, were not soft anymore. They carried the record of what they had done the same way the oak carried the record of the wine, not as damage but as information, permanent evidence of a history that had changed the material at a cellular level. The barn in 2005 was a different physical space from the one August had left. Her better lit, better organized, equipped with machines that August would have found remarkable. But in the corner where his tool chest had always stood, it still stood. The tools inside it were the same tools she had cleaned on the first day of October 1977. The hand planes and chisels and draw knife and spokes. Have their blades maintained now with the micro bevels she had learned from Silas Drummond, their handles worn to the same smooth saddle shape that August's grip had created over decades of use. They were working tools, not museum pieces. She used them every day for the finish work that machines could not do. Decker was running the rough preparation now largely independently, his feel for the material reliable enough that she did not need to supervise. This left her the finish work, the final stages, the work that required the full application of everything she had learned in 28 years of conversation with wine-cured oak. She was good at it in the way that people are good at things they have done long enough that the skill has stopped being visible to the person performing. It has become simply the way the hands move through a familiar task without the conscious mind having to narrate each step. The young apprentice had been with her for 7 months. His name was Garrett Lyle, 22 years old, with the specific impatience of talented young people who can see the quality they want to achieve and cannot yet reconcile that vision with the slowness required to actually achieve it. He had come to her through a woodworking program at a community college in Corvallis, whose instructor had written her a letter handwritten, which she appreciated, explaining that Garrett had gifts that the program could no longer fully accommodate, and that she might be the right person to see what those gifts could become. On an October morning, she found him at the bench, struggling with a particularly dense stave, one of the oldest in the remaining inventory, its tannin content visible in the near black of its interior color, its fibers compressed by years to a hardness that required the most careful blade work to surface without tearing. He was pressing down on the plane with his full body weight forcing the issue, and she could hear from across the barn that the blade was chattering rather than cutting the same sound she had produced in her first October in this barn, the sound of a tool being asked to do something faster than the material was willing to do it. She walked to the bench. She did not say anything immediately. She stood beside him for one full pass of the plane, listening to the chatter, watching the surface it left behind. Then she put her hand over his on the plane, not to take the tool from him, but to stop him, to interrupt the momentum of his effort before it became a habit. "Close your eyes." Her voice quiet, not without warmth, but not soft either, the voice of someone who knows that what they are about to say matters. This wood has been alive in some form since before either of us was born. It grew for 100 years in a forest you'll never see. It spent 5 years holding wine in a barrel on a ridge above this valley. It has been waiting in that pile since 1977. It is not in a hurry. It will never be in a hurry. The only question is whether you are willing to move at its speed or whether you insist on moving at yours. He stood still under her hand for a moment. She felt the tension in his grip on the plane shift, the pressure reducing, the white knuckle quality releasing. Now move the plane the way you would move your hand across something you were afraid of damaging. He did. The shaving that came off was not perfect. It was not continuous. It broke twice where the grain changed direction. But it was clean at the break, not torn, and the surface left behind had the beginning of what a correct surface looked like. The very beginning, the first hint of what was possible when the tool moved with the material's own logic rather than against it. She went to the tool chest. She took out August's bench plane, the number 4, its body worn at the front knob, where August's left hand had rested against it for 50 years, the tote at the rear polished by the grip of a right hand that was no longer there to hold it. She carried it to the bench, set it down beside the plane Garrett had been using. He looked at it, looked at her. "My grandfather brought this from the old country when he came to Oregon." She picked up the plane, turned it in her hands, feeling the weight of it settle the way it always settled, the way something settles when it has been calibrated to your hands by long use. "He gave it to me the only way he could give it to me, which was by leaving it behind when he died. I didn't understand what he was giving me for a long time. I thought he was giving me a tool. He was giving me a way of seeing." She set it in Garrett's hands. Silas Drummond up in the mountains outside Cottage Grove gave me 2 days of his time in 1980 and changed everything I thought I knew about how to listen to a piece of wood. I'm giving you that too right now, though it'll take you longer than 2 days to hear it. She stepped back from the bench. The plane is yours. The obligation that comes with it is simple. When you've learned what it can teach you, you pass it to someone else. That's the only payment I'm asking for. Garrett held the plane in both hands, looking down at it the way she had looked at the broken stave on the hillside in September of 1977, with the beginning of an understanding that had not yet resolved itself into clarity, the earliest stage of a conversation between a person and a material that would take years to develop into fluency. Outside the barn, October had arrived in the valley with its characteristic mixture of gold and rain, the hills above the property carrying the first color changes of the season, the fir trees on the ridge holding their dark green against the lighter gold of the big leaf maples in the creek bottom. The clearing behind the tree line was empty. Now had been empty for 12 years, the alders and blackberries reclaiming the ground with a thoroughness that would erase any evidence of the barrel pile within another decade. Harlan Pruitt's land, her land now, the Trust's land, forever spread across the valley's southern edge, 400 acres of Oregon ground that would remain exactly what it was, regardless of what the surrounding valley became. The farmhouse still had the same porch, where she had stood with cold coffee, watching the first flatbed truck come up the drive. The porch bench was not the one she had made in 1981, that one had gone to a collector in Seattle 10 years earlier. And she had made herself a replacement from the last of the oldest barrels, the ones at the very bottom of the pile, the ones that had been on the ground the longest, whose wood had a depth of color that even she, after 28 years of working this material, found remarkable. She had given away more than a plane this morning. She knew it the way you know things that are true without requiring proof. The knowledge arriving not as conclusion, but as recognition. Everything that had been given to her in the form of August silence, and his notebooks and his canvas apron still smelling faintly of his presence. Everything that Silas Drummond had conveyed in 2 days of wordless demonstration on a mountain above Cottage Grove. Everything that the wood itself had taught her through 28 years of patient insistence on being understood on its own terms rather than hers. All of it was in that plane now in Garrett Lyle's hands, moving through the world, the same way the wine had moved through the oak, slowly, completely changing the material at a level deeper than the surface. Blackwood Ridge Vineyards had seen 847 barrels reach the end of their useful life. They had seen a disposal problem, a cost to be managed, a material that had given everything it had to give. They had been right about some of that. The barrels were spent in the sense that they were finished. They were at the end of one thing. What Everett Calloway had not known, what his Clause 4 had not accounted for, what his practiced smile and his leather folder and his mutual benefit had never considered, was that the end of one thing and the beginning of another are not two separate events. They are the same moment viewed from different positions, the difference between them determined entirely by whether you are the kind of person who sees what something has been or the kind of person who sees what it is still capable of becoming. August Voss had spent his life finding proof of that principle in the discarded materials of a discarding world. He had passed the principle to his granddaughter in the form of a canvas apron and a set of well-maintained tools, and a notebook sentence she had read 100 times without understanding it until she was standing on a hillside in September light with a broken piece of oak in her hand. The winery had thrown away 847 barrels of spent wood. Maren Voss had spent 28 years proving that spent was not the same as finished, that waste was exactly what her grandfather had always said it was, that the wood which had endured the most still had always had the most left to give.